The creature in the cave was not a monster. Not entirely. It had the shape of one. 3 meters of gray-black mass, shoulders like load-bearing stone, fingers ending in claws that had left parallel grooves in the walls, deep enough to lose your fist in. Red fog clung to it in slow wisps, the way smoke clings to something that has been burning for a long time and refuses to stop. But the detail that locked Song Rui's feet to the tunnel floor, the specific wrong thing, was the eyes. Calm, measuring, present. The eyes of a person who remembered everything about being one. Before the fog took him, he had been Song Xiao, her uncle. Across the chamber, something enormous charged through the dark. A fully evolved giant, its footfalls shaking the walls. The kind of monster that a full military unit would plan an entire operation to kill. Song Xiao didn't turn. He waited until it nearly reached him, then drove one arm through its skull. The sound it made hitting the floor rolled through the cave and died away slowly. He shook his hand clean. He turned to the 2 people at the tunnel entrance. He said, in a voice that was entirely his own, unhurried, almost conversational, that he had heard about the young soldier on his niece's left. He had heard the boy could absorb monster cores directly into his own body. He wanted to see that himself. The soldier in question was Yan Hao. He had gone very still the moment they entered the chamber, the way you go still when no option the situation offers is actually good. Song Rui stepped forward. She called her uncle's name. She told him she had been searching for 6 months, that there was still a way back from this, that she had not stopped believing he was still in there. Her voice held steady, her hands were shaking. He looked at her, the way you look at someone saying something that was once true, but no longer applies. Then he moved. It was not a fight. Song Rui's body hit the stone floor before Hao had fully processed the movement, and the cave went quiet, except for the echo of the impact fading. Hao moved because nothing else was operating in him. Not strategy, not calculation, just rage carrying him forward with everything he had spent 6 months building. His claws, the energy stored in his chest crystal, every absorbed ability igniting at once. Song Xiao caught him by the forearm and held him still. He looked at Hao with something that read, unmistakably, as genuine curiosity. Then the cave ceiling cracked. Blue-white light poured through the fissure, and something descended through it. Massive, winged, scaled in colors that had no place underground. It landed between them and the floor fractured under its weight. The girl on its back looked down at Hao with eyes that were steady and exhausted, and 20 years older than the last time he had seen them. Zhu. Alive. On a dragon. She had been searching for him the same way he had been searching for her. They had both arrived at the worst possible moment, and later, much later, when he had the quiet to think about it, he would understand how she had gotten here, what had been done to her, and what she had agreed to in the time between. But to understand any of that, you have to go back to the day the world cracked open. An archaeological team had been excavating an ancient site at the city's eastern edge when they unsealed something that had been sealed for reasons nobody alive had thought to document. What rose from the shaft was not immediately visible. A smell first. Something like old copper and damp stone forced together, wrong in a way that registered before the brain caught up. Then a pressure change. 3 team members began behaving in ways that had no ordinary explanation, and by the time the site supervisor reached his radio, the exits were already compromised. The red fog spread through the city the way water moves through cloth, not along roads, not following any logic the emergency systems could outpace. It found the lowest points, drainage channels, underpasses, the natural tilt of old streets toward older ones. It moved below knee height at first, invisible except for the faint reddish cast it gave the air near the ground when afternoon light caught it at the right angle. People kept expecting to see it coming, and kept not seeing it until it was already past them. The fog infected what it touched. People who breathed enough of it changed. Some lost only their minds. Others lost their shape as well. Animals absorbed it like parched ground absorbs rain. Completely, irreversibly. And what emerged bore only a general silhouette of what they had been before. The city had no time to form a plan before the streets filled with both. Yan Hao had been at school when the alert started. He got home through the park and the service alley behind the neighbor's building, a route he had been using since he was 12, and his mother had always disapproved of. His family was in the living room when he arrived, his father on the phone. his mother already guiding Zhu toward the door, Zhu clutching a small pink rabbit to her chest with both hands, not crying yet because her mother was still projecting calm, and she was following that lead. They left in the car because the roads were still passable. For 20 minutes, it seemed like it would hold. His father found a route east, toward the evacuation checkpoint broadcasting on the emergency channel, and the traffic moved. Slowly, but moved. Then the truck came from the left. The driver had panicked and found a gap on the wrong side of the intersection. The angle of impact drove the front of the family car back and inward. Hao hit his seatbelt and tasted blood. Zhu cried out. When he got his breath and turned around, she was unhurt, pressed into the seat, eyes wide, the pink rabbit on the floor, and his parents were not. His father's legs were pinned. The dashboard had shifted back far enough that extraction without equipment was impossible. His mother was against a door the truck's frame was now holding shut, and she could turn her head but nothing else. Both of them were conscious. That was the part Hao would carry for years. Not the sounds from outside, not the smell of the fog reaching the intersection, but the specific calmness his parents adopted in that moment, the face of a decision that had been made before it needed to be spoken aloud. His father used the voice, the one Hao had heard exactly 3 times in his life, each time attached to a situation in which negotiation was finished. He told Hao to take Zhu. He said to go to the checkpoint. He said it once, clearly, and did not repeat it. His mother reached back with one arm, took the pink rabbit from Zhu's hands, and placed it in Hao's. She told Zhu her brother would carry it, so she could move faster. She said it lightly, as if this were a sensible logistical arrangement, rather than the last thing she expected to give her daughter. Hao got out of the car. He lifted Zhu through the door. He stood on the pavement and looked back through the cracked windshield at his father, a man holding himself very carefully against something enormous, and then at his mother, who met his eyes and nodded once. He walked. Zhu asked where they were going. He said the checkpoint. She asked about their parents. He told her a different route, coming separately. She was 7 years old and sharp enough to hear the space in that answer. But she kept hold of his hand and kept walking, and he did not look back again. The checkpoint was noise and motion, and military personnel trying to channel thousands of people in too many directions. Hao moved through the first 2 barriers by staying embedded in larger family groups, invisible in the crowd's momentum. The 3rd checkpoint stopped him. A medic with a scanner flagged him immediately. Not visibly infected, no physical symptoms yet, but the blood chemistry reading came back elevated in ways the protocol sheet was not ambiguous about. A supervisor conferred with the medic, glanced at Zhu, and made a call. They said the helicopter manifests were full. They said he would be processed through secondary assessment. They said someone would come back. He walked Zhu to the boarding line himself, on the pretext of confirming her name on the manifest. He guided her to the front and transferred her hand to the sleeve of a soldier escorting unaccompanied children. He crouched to her level and told her quietly, just between them, that he needed to go back and check on their parents and that she should get on the aircraft and wait for him at the other end. He pressed the pink rabbit into her arms and told her to hold on to it until he arrived. She looked at him for a long moment. Then the boarding sequence started and the crowd moved and she went, holding the sleeve in front of her, and he stood there until the aircraft door closed. He watched the helicopter from behind a chain-link enclosure 40 meters away. It lifted into the gray afternoon sky. Then Zhu's face appeared at one of the small windows. She had found him in all that crowd below. He still didn't understand how, and her palm was pressed flat against the glass. He raised his hand. He held it up as the aircraft climbed, kept it raised until the helicopter became a shape against the clouds, and then a point, and then nothing at all. He lowered his arm and sat down with his back against the fence and stayed there until he was finished. The fog reached the checkpoint 40 minutes later. The secondary queue had not been cleared. Hao ran when it hit, not from any plan, but because his body had developed strong new opinions about what to do with the energy the fog was pressing into it. Things in the fog found him within the first block. He killed them in ways he couldn't fully reconstruct afterward, his hands not entirely his own, his mind going white at the edges and then pulling back by something he couldn't name, a sound, or the memory of one, his sister calling his name in the car with that particular frightened clarity. It brought him back to himself every time. He came out the other side of the fog zone at first light. A survivor camp materialized 3 days later, and he put his sister's name on every list and gave it to every person holding a clipboard. No records matched. The Border Patrol recruitment desk appeared in week 6. The sign listed posting locations. Kishi checkpoint sat at the eastern edge of the fog zone, closer to answers than anything else currently available to him. He signed his name without reading the rest of the form. Kishi was the kind of posting that received soldiers the military had other plans for. Low priority, thin supply budget, a rotation of personnel nobody tracked closely. Hao arrived and established himself as a chronically late, frequently absent recruit, whose captain, Jia, produced explanations that were plausible enough not to require investigation. The garrison commander who made periodic inspections had learned to simply note the pattern rather than pursue it. The other recruits had opinions about Hao, the predictable opinions of people who mistake dismissal for accuracy. Not one of them knew what he was doing in the fog zone at night. What they saw was a border patrolman who couldn't maintain a schedule. What they didn't see was someone 4 months into a systematic experiment with his own body, carefully controlled exposures to fog energy, measured doses, learning exactly where the line was between himself and what the fog wanted to make him, and learning how to walk up to that line deliberately and come back. Every time he came back, the line moved further out. The surge that changed everything came on a gray Tuesday without particular warning. The zone boundary pushed outward by 2 kilometers in under an hour, and every creature embedded in that territory moved with it toward the Kishi perimeter. 2 Overlord-class monsters in the initial wave. Dozens of scouts fanning out ahead, probing for gaps. Standing orders for a border patrol unit under surge conditions were clear. Fall back to the secondary defense line. Captain Jia gave the order. Hao had already spotted the gap in the left flank. A scout had slipped through in the confusion of the first alarm, threading between 2 barriers at the angle the designers hadn't accounted for, moving fast toward a civilian shelter 200 meters back. He told Jia he had seen it, and was moving before Jia finished the sentence he'd been forming, to say that wasn't Hao's decision. He caught the scout in an alley 2 blocks back. He killed it in under a minute. He was standing over it with his hands returned to ordinary hands when footsteps stopped at the alley entrance and he looked up. Song Rui was not the kind of person who startled easily. She commanded a Burning Blood mobile strike unit, and that assignment had a way of selecting out the people who startled easily fairly quickly. She stood at the alley entrance in equipment that cost more than Hao's entire pay for the year, and she looked at the dead scout. She looked at him. The kill showed no weapon marks matching anything in the Border Patrol's inventory. There were no wounds on Hao. She told him not to move. He didn't. He was still calculating whether any version of what came next was in his favor when the ground beneath both of them gave way entirely. The cave system below the Kishi district had been expanding for months, the fog hollowing soft stone as it spread through the bedrock. The section directly below the alley had been the thinnest part, and the surge's pressure differential finished what the fog had started. The floor dropped 8 meters in one fast, decisive motion, and Hao and Song Rui and 3 of her soldiers hit the cave floor in a cloud of dust and broken stone. Song Rui was on her feet before the dust settled. She looked around at the passages opening in every direction, assessed the shapes moving in the dark beyond, and said, without alarm, just precision, that they needed to move immediately. Hao stood up. He brushed stone from his jacket and looked at the same passages she was looking at, listening to what was moving in them. He told her he knew his way around underground. She gave him a look that held several questions she didn't have time to ask. Then she nodded and said to show her. The cave system below Kishi was not mapped. Song Rui's unit had no data on it. The fog had expanded it gradually over 6 months, and whatever the Border Patrol had filed about underground anomalies in the district had never been flagged to Burning Blood's intelligence arm. What Hao carried in his own head from 4 months of nighttime trips through the fog zone, the way sound traveled differently when a tunnel opened into a larger chamber, the pressure change when a corridor dead-ended, and the movement patterns of the creatures that lived in these passages once you understood what drew their attention. He moved fast, with Song Rui's team behind him. For the first 100 meters it held. The tunnels ran east in broad channels the fog had carved through soft limestone, and the creatures they encountered were scout class. Quick, aggressive, but manageable in sequence. Song Rui's soldiers handled 2 without breaking stride. Hao cleared the 3rd with his forearm before it reached a private who had stumbled on loose stone. Then the passage opened into a central chamber, and the ceiling above them was covered. Not scouts. Something in between. Armored, chitinous creatures clinging to the rock like a second surface, disturbed by the vibration of footsteps, beginning to drop. A soldier behind Hao started a count and abandoned it at 30. Song Rui ordered a withdrawal to the passage entrance. The team pulled back efficiently, and most of them made it. The soldier at the rear didn't. A dropping creature caught him across the shoulder and drove him to the ground. He was newer than Hao, which was saying something, and the weight of it had knocked the breath out of him. He was on his knees, not moving fast enough. Two more were descending toward him. What happened next took approximately 2 seconds. A large man stepped past Hao and planted himself over the downed soldier. His name was Yongji, Song Rui's deputy. Built wide and plated across the arms and chest with reinforced material the other soldiers didn't carry. He took both impacts on crossed forearms, absorbed them, and swept the creature's back with a single motion. He got the younger soldier upright. He pushed him toward the passage. One of the creatures hit him from the side, low, where the plating had a seam. Yongji went down on one knee. He stayed there a moment, jaw locked, and then he stood. He told Song Rui he was fine. His voice said otherwise. They fell back to the passage, and the creatures did not pursue into the narrower corridor. Song Rui ran her assessment. Yongji had a deep laceration along his left side that needed sealing now, not later. The private had a dislocated shoulder and a glazed expression. No confirmed route back up. A swarm between them and the chamber's far side. Song Rui pulled Hao back against the wall. She told him quietly that if there was something he hadn't shown her yet, now was the time. He looked at her for a moment. He said there was. What he showed her over the next 20 minutes was not everything. The instinct to portion it out had become a reflex, and the reflex was still running, but the edge of necessary kept moving. The narrow passages delivered creatures in ones and twos, and each time the situation required something a border patrolman shouldn't have been able to do. A hit with too much force, a reach with arms extending at the wrong angle, a moment where an impact that should have broken something in him simply didn't. Song Rui watched all of it. Her expression didn't shift in any way that told him what she was concluding. When a corridor opened into a mid-sized chamber with a low enough ceiling to fight in, she arranged her soldiers in a formation that gave Hao the center and didn't ask him to explain anything. She gave him room. He used it. A private behind her watched Hao's arm after the third engagement and asked the soldier beside him what kind of equipment that was. Song Rui told him, without pausing, that Hao was a product of a classified research program, a laboratory subject who had escaped documentation and ended up in border patrol through a processing gap. She said the program could not appear in any report he filed. She said if he filed one anyway, she would request his transfer to a station so remote it didn't appear on standard maps. The private decided he hadn't seen anything unusual. The armored overlord found them in the deepest chamber. It had been there before they arrived, and the swarm above was the outer layer of its territory. An overlord-class creature, fully evolved, 3 meters at the shoulder, hexapedal, its exoskeleton layered in plates that the scout's shells only gestured at. A standard Burning Blood squad would have approached something like this with a coordinated plan and a reasonable expectation that at least one of them would be seriously hurt. Song Rui's team had Yongji limited to one functional arm, was short on supplies, and was standing in a cave they hadn't known existed an hour ago. She pulled Hao back against the chamber wall and explained the Overlord's structure fast and precisely, the way someone explains something they have studied, rather than read about. The ventral seam below the third pair of legs. The exposed nerve node at the base of the skull where the plates didn't fully articulate. She told him that concentrated electrical discharge at that node would cascade through the creature's nervous system faster than it could redirect its defensive musculature. Hao said he didn't have electrical ability. She told him she did. She showed him the bracelet on her wrist, core channeling equipment, electromagnetic ability. She said she needed the creature to stop moving for 2 seconds, just long enough for her to reach the node. She said one good hold if he could manage it. The Overlord had been watching them during this exchange with the patient attention of something that had never needed to hurry because nothing in its territory had ever given it reason to. Hao looked at the creature. He thought briefly about the fastest way to make something stop moving, and then he moved. He took the hit it gave him first, deliberately, which was the part that cost him. He let it drive him back toward the wall because the wall was where Song Rui's approach needed to come from, and the node was on that side, and he needed the creature's weight fully committed in that direction. The impact cracked his chest crystal. He felt it, a hairline fracture spreading through the energy structure he had spent months building. He kept his grip on the overlord's foreleg regardless. Song Rui moved along the wall while the creature was occupied entirely with Hao. She reached the skull's base, pressed her bracelet to the node, and released. The discharge passed through the overlord in a single wave. The creature went still, not permanently, but long enough. Every functional member of the team hit the exposed ventral seam simultaneously. Hao hit it last, having shifted his grip during the half-second the creature's nervous system was rebooting. The core inside the overlord was accessible at the seam. He reached it and pulled. The creature's body came down around him. He was inside it when the internal energy released. The core came free, and the backlash hit him all at once. Months of accumulated red fog energy from an overlord-tier monster flooding into a chest crystal that was already cracked. He felt the fracture spread to the entire structure, and then something happened that had no precedent in his experience. Instead of collapsing, the crystal reformed. Larger, denser. The core didn't shatter against him the way smaller ones had in training. It fused. He sat down in the remains of the overlord and waited for the chamber to stop spinning. Song Rui pulled the body off him, crouched, and looked at his chest where the crystal had reformed, visible through the torn jacket, pulsing faintly. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she told him to breathe and told her team to give him space. Yongji, still upright through sheer determination, looked at the crystal with the expression of a man updating several recent assumptions simultaneously. He said he was fairly certain the mission briefing had not mentioned any of this. Song Rui agreed that it hadn't. They found the secondary exit 2 hours later, a crack in the eastern wall that Hao had correctly identified by air pressure, wide enough to move through single file, surfacing 200 meters from the Kishi perimeter. Yongji needed help on the slope. The private with the dislocated shoulder carried his own weight without a word, which earned him something in Song Rui's estimation that she didn't express. Hao sat against the outside wall of the barrier for 20 minutes after they surfaced, working through the absorbed energy. The crystal was stable, but the volume it now held was new, more than he had carried before, pressing at the edges of his control in a way that required careful management. He found the release gradually, venting it down through his arms in controlled amounts until the pressure eased. He was still doing this when a shadow settled over him. Song Rui crouched to his level, told her soldiers to give her a moment, and then looked at Hao in the particular way of someone who has arrived at a position and is choosing how to present it. She said she had watched him for 2 hours in conditions where concealment was impossible. She said she understood why he had hidden it and wasn't disputing the reasoning. She told him the situation had 2 paths. The first, she filed an accurate report. A border patrolman with unregistered absorption ability went through military classification for anomalous subjects, and that process had a range of outcomes, and almost none of them ended with the subject keeping autonomy. The second, she filed a report with gaps. He entered burning blood candidacy under the lab subject cover she had already established with her team. He trained, he operated under her authority, and in exchange, she extended her protection. She said she had access to military intelligence channels that Border Patrol couldn't touch. She said she understood he was looking for someone. He asked how she knew that. She said the patrolman who worked beside him had mentioned a photograph Hao kept in his gear bag, and that it was a photograph of a girl, and that people who kept photographs like that in active service gear usually had a specific reason. Hao looked at the stone beside him for a moment. He said he wanted access to refugee intake records from 6 months ago. Eastern Checkpoint, an unaccompanied child who had disappeared from the registration system afterward. Song Rui said she could pursue that. He told her he was in. Zhang Shi appeared 2 days later. The garrison commander of Kishi was a compact, well-groomed man with the particular manner of someone who had spent years in a posting that nobody with more ability wanted. He arrived at the mess with 2 personal attendants, the garrison equivalent of hired emphasis, and he had Captain Jia's transfer paperwork in his hand. The paperwork had moved without consulting him, which was technically correct procedure, and obviously not how he had expected it to work. He addressed Jia in the tone of a man accustomed to delivering assessments in front of an audience. He said Jia had allowed a persistent discipline problem to run for 4 months. He said Jia had covered for a recruit who had no business in uniform. He said the fact that this same recruit was being moved to an elite unit rather than discharged reflected a systemic failure rather than any genuine merit. Jia stood and received this without expression. He had been doing exactly that for longer than Hao had been stationed here, and the absence of expression had become something like professionalism. One of Jiang Shi's attendants stepped slightly toward Jia, just slightly, the kind of repositioning that establishes a hierarchy without formally invoking it. Hao stepped between them. He didn't do anything else. He stood there and looked at the attendant until the attendant made a quiet decision about whether this particular situation was what he had agreed to when he started working for Jiang Shi. The attendant took a step back. Jiang Shi fixed his attention on Hao. He said a recruit who couldn't maintain a guard rotation was an unusual choice to make a point about authority. Hao told him that Captain Jia answered to his chain of command, and then to Song Rui's unit, and that Jiang Shi was neither, and that if he wanted to continue the conversation, he was welcome to raise it with Burning Blood's commanding officer. Jiang Shi left. He left at a measured pace, the kind that communicates that the person leaving has both noted this and made a decision about it. Hao filed the exit away. Once the commander was out of earshot, Jia told Hao that he had just created a problem for himself that his current rank couldn't handle.
He said it plainly, without softening, the way a good captain accounts for what he sees. Hao said he'd work on his rank.
The Burning Blood entrance examination at Hucheng drew candidates from every branch of the military's tiered structure, and the filtering process had been designed to discourage people who were merely good. Recruits who had been well-regarded at their home posting arrived, and discovered that well-regarded in the wider military and competitive within Burning Blood occupied different positions on the same scale. Chang Jin was the kind of candidate who arrived with a reputation already formed, family connections in the officer class, numbers that had been circulated in planning rooms before the examination opened. He stood with two candidates of similar background and surveyed the field with the comfortable eye of someone who expected to place well. He noticed Hao across the assembly area, assessed him briefly, and looked elsewhere. The physical tests ran across the first 2 days. Hao moved through them with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent 4 months navigating terrain that was actively trying to mutate him. He posted the day's best time on the obstacle course by a margin the examining officer read aloud twice. 3 of the 4 strength disciplines produced new records. The examiner stopped the 4th event after Hao's 4th repetition and made a note without sharing what it said. By the 3rd event, Chang Jin had filed a query with the examination oversight officer. He said the results were inconsistent with a border patrol classification. He said the records should be verified. He said something was off. The examining officer, a heavy-set woman with 20 years of selection duty, listened to this with the patience of someone who would not be changing her process. She said the records had been verified. She said the numbers were accurate. She said if Chang Jin had further concerns, he was welcome to rerun the events and subject his own results to the same scrutiny. Chang Jin withdrew the query. The compatibility test on the 3rd day produced the examination's most significant result. Each candidate slotted a standard test core into a bracelet and held the reading for 60 seconds, while the equipment registered their synchronization percentage, a theoretical maximum of 100 on the scale. Scores above 60 in the room were considered exceptional. Chang Jin scored 62 and received it with satisfaction, which was not unreasonable in context. Jin Ying, a civilian researcher from the weapons division, present for a quarterly department assessment rather than as a military candidate, scored 78 and stood afterward to one side of the room with a small, practiced expression that suggested this outcome was familiar to her. Hao slotted the test core and held the reading. The display locked after 11 seconds. The number it showed was not a number. It was the output the device produced when it encountered something outside its calibration range. The technician tapped the display, switched to a secondary reader, and ran the test again. The secondary reader produced the same non-result. Jin Ying walked over from where she had been standing. She looked at the display, pulled a personal scanner from her jacket, and held it near the bracelet. She read the output, and then looked at Hao, and then at the primary technician, in a way that moved information between them without saying anything aloud. She told the examining officer to flag the result for escalation to senior research. She said the equipment was functioning correctly. The examining officer asked what the result was. Jin Ying said the device's theoretical maximum was 100%, and that Hao's reading had exceeded that maximum by a margin the calibration wasn't built to express as a number. She delivered this in the tone of someone reporting an accurate measurement. Not a surprising claim, just a measurement. The room went quiet in the specific way of a space where something has happened, and the people in it haven't decided yet how to react. Kang Jin looked at Hao from across the testing area with an expression that had moved past dismissal into something else. A recalibration happening behind his eyes, and the recalibration clearly uncomfortable. The broken reading reached senior command inside 24 hours. Song Liang was Song Rui's father and the regional chief of staff, a man whose response to unusual results was to gather the most informed people in the room and listen before concluding. He sat across from Jin Anshin, the senior weapons researcher Jin Ying technically reported to, and listened while Anshin explained what the compatibility reading meant in practical terms. Anshin said it meant how could theoretically interface with any core type at full efficiency, without equipment, without the compatibility ceiling that constrained every other warrior in the military's entire system. He said the operational applications were significant. He said the research applications were also significant. He paused there in a way that left space for Song Liang to indicate which category he weighted more heavily. Song Liang said he was assigning Hao to Captain Yang Xing's unit, effective immediately. Anshin had expected Hao to go to Song Rui. She had found him, filed the original paperwork, and had every practical claim to him as a candidate. The reassignment to Yang Xing was Liang's method of establishing that whoever had discovered Hao, decisions about what happened next, sat one level above his daughter's authority. Song Rui received the reassignment notice, filed her acknowledgement, and immediately began working out how much of Hao's operational time she could reasonably reclaim through inter-unit training protocols. She had known her father long enough to recognize the move for what it was, and had decided that fighting the first placement was not the ground she wanted to spend credit on. Hao read the reassignment, considered whether contesting it was worth the cost, and decided it wasn't yet. Yang Xing ran a competent unit. More importantly, Song Rui's intelligence access had already produced something, a partial refugee intake record, flagged as incomplete, from the eastern checkpoint 6 months ago. A girl, unaccompanied, registered, then transferred, the record said, for specialized placement. The record ended there. He read it 3 times. He put it in his gear bag beside the pink rabbit, and he reported to Yang Xing's unit the following morning. On time, for once, which caused the administrative officer to note it in the log with the quiet surprise of someone who had read the file and expected something different. The search for Zhu now had a direction. Everything that followed, every mission, every calculated accumulation of standing within a system he had joined for exactly this purpose, would move along that thread. He just didn't know yet how many things stood between him and where it led. The underground facility was deeper than the entrance suggested. Hao woke in a holding room with reinforced walls and a single light source in the ceiling, and his first systematic thought was that the crystal in his chest was intact and the energy inside it was intact, which meant Liu Fang's device had overwhelmed his processing rather than his storage. He was not substantially hurt. He was also not restrained, which told him something about how confident Greenvine was in the room's containment. He assessed the door for 90 seconds and then stopped assessing it, because the door was not the most interesting thing in the adjacent corridor. He could hear breathing, a specific pattern, slow, deliberate, the breathing of someone who had been conserving energy for a while. He knew the rhythm. Captain Jia was 2 rooms down. The guards outside his room were 3, posted at intervals that assumed any threat would come from the corridor entrance rather than from inside the room, because the facility's previous subjects had not walked out of high-density fog blasts and gone back to immediate planning. Hao put all 3 down with the contact compound in the space of 40 seconds, moving through the corridor with the particular quality of quiet he had developed during 4 months of nighttime excursions into fog zones, where quiet was the difference between a training session and a situation. Jia looked up when Hao came through the door. He said Hao was late, which was consistent across the entire span of their acquaintance. They moved through the facility systematically. Not quickly. Quickly in an unfamiliar space with uncertain personnel distribution was how you ran into someone you weren't ready for, but with the steady tempo of clearing ground that wouldn't be left to clear again. Jia knew the layout of 2 corridors from the routes he had been walked during his time here, and Hao could read the fog concentration gradient to identify which sections housed the living subjects, which housed the research equipment, and which were administrative. What they found in the administrative section, on a drive that Jia identified from a previous glimpse through an open door, completed the picture Jiangxi had started. Green Vine's trafficking pipeline from the Qixi border district was one node in a network that covered 7 checkpoints across the region. Soldiers assigned to classified missions, civilians processed through transit facilities, individuals flagged in intake screening as high compatibility types, all routed into the program through layers of legitimate-looking documentation. The research subjects in the holding wing were stored in specialized medical capsules, the same general class as the stabilization unit Howe had been transported in, but older and running on minimum settings. Not killing the subjects, not yet. Green Vine needed them alive for the experimental phases. Ashua was in the 4th capsule from the end, older than Ali's photograph had suggested, hollowed out in the way prolonged capsule suspension hollowed people, but alive. His bio readings were stable. Howe stood there for a moment. He told Jia they were getting everyone out. Jia said that was going to be complicated, given the current number of personnel they had available for extraction, which was 2. He said it in a tone that made clear he was noting the complication rather than objecting to the goal. Howe told him Song Rue was already running the perimeter and that they had approximately 12 minutes before her team came through the east access. Jia said he wished Howe had led with that. Song Rue came through the east access in 11. She had Jin Ying, Yang Ji, and Captain Yang Sing's team behind her, which was more firepower than Howe had expected, and which Song Rue had assembled through a combination of legitimate operational authority and, he suspected, the particular version of her father's stubbornness that she had refined into something more elegant. They cleared the facility in 20 minutes. The capsule subjects were loaded for medical transport. Zhang Shi, who had been found in the command room attempting to encrypt his communications and succeeding at neither task, was taken into custody. Lu Fang appeared at the end of the main corridor when they were 90% of the way done. He had used Green Vine's fog emitter on himself, not a targeted blast, a sustained personal dose, the kind that the research division had been developing as an emergency combat enhancement, boosting ability output beyond the subject's natural ceiling at the cost of structural stability. His body was showing it already, the joints at his shoulders and neck working at angles they weren't designed for, the skin along his arms doing something that red fog energy at high concentrations did to skin. He was significantly more powerful than he had been when he put Howe down in the drainage facility. He was also, Howe noted, not going to be able to maintain this for long before the enhancement stopped being an enhancement. Song Rue and Jin Ying took him from 2 angles, while Howe came from the 3rd. The fight was brutal and expensive in the specific way of fighting something that was actively destabilizing, the power level climbing and the structure failing simultaneously, making every engagement unpredictable. Song Rue took a hit to her side that she absorbed through gritted teeth and kept operating. Jin Ying's wind ability bought the coordination gaps they needed. Howe drove through the last gap when Lu Fang's stabilization finally collapsed under the weight of what he'd put into himself, and it was over. Yang Sing's team held the exit while the capsule transport moved. Howe carried 2 subjects himself. Jia covered the rear. 3 days in a medical unit, Howe's crystal had absorbed secondary energies from Lu Fang's boosted output during the fight, requiring careful integration. He spent the time horizontal and using it to process what was in the file on Zhu, Dragon-type affinity, abnormal power, the specific language of a research designation for someone who had processed red fog energy in a direction the program had not previously documented. He thought about the helicopter window. He thought about how many months it had been, and what months in a research program meant for a 7-year-old girl whose only protection going in had been that her brother had made sure she got on the aircraft before the fog got to him. He got up on day 4 without waiting for the medical clearance. The 3-month consolidation period that followed was, officially, a training program. What it actually was, Song Liang pulling every person and thread connected to Howe into a formation he could supervise while the internal leak investigation concluded and the political fallout from the Green Vine facility exposure was managed. Green Vine denied the facility. Green Vine denied any knowledge of Zhang Shi's activities. The legal structure that protected corporate contractors from military prosecution in peacetime was substantial and well-maintained, and the officers who owned shares in those structures had opinions about how aggressively the investigation should proceed. Zhang Shi confessed. It didn't matter as much as it should have. What mattered operationally was Ashuo, who woke from suspension after 9 days and stabilized across another 3 weeks, and who confirmed, when he could speak consistently, that he had last seen Zhu at the San intake facility being moved to a secondary processing site under the designation Alpha Priority Transport. He had memorized the transport schedule the way you memorize things when you understood that the memory might be the only record. He gave Hao the date, the destination code, and the name of the senior researcher who had signed the transfer, Hong Zenon. Meanwhile, within the Burning Blood training program, the contribution point system produced a friction that Hao had not anticipated and then decided was not his problem. His mission record since joining, the cave, the beehive nest, the Kishi rescue, generated a point total that outpaced every other recruit in the program by a margin that attracted commentary. A senior captain named Tanji resolved the commentary by wagering publicly against the legitimacy of Hao's score and then losing a sparring match against him, cleanly and in front of enough witnesses that the commentary stopped. Tanji conceded the wager with a graciousness that Hao filed away as noteworthy. In his experience, people who lost well in public were generally managing something. The news about Song Xiao came through Song Liang's intelligence channels. Song Rui's uncle had resurfaced near the city of San, a sentient, speech-capable monster-type orc classification, operating with tactical intelligence that put him above anything the district's military presence was configured to handle. Song Liang had privately concluded that if containment proved impossible, elimination was the correct call, regardless of who Song Xiao had been before the fog took him. Song Rui found out about the elimination order through the same channels she always found out about things she wasn't officially supposed to know yet. She left that night. San was a city that had reorganized itself around fog zone adjacency in the way cities did. Industry that could operate near the border running at the outer edges, residential density pulled back toward the center, the in-between zones occupied by the kind of economy that thrives where legitimate oversight is thin. Jin Ying tracked Song Rui's route through the district's monitoring network, shared it with Hao, and said she was coming with him to San because someone competent needed to be present, and she had decided she was that person. They found Song Rui in the industrial outer district, where a man named Aaron was running a mining operation through a fog-adjacent crack in the bedrock, pulling rare red energy ore from a deposit that belonged, by every legal standard, to the regional military authority. He had been running it for 8 months with borrowed security and a very clear read of which administrators could be given reasons to look elsewhere. Song Rui had been working through his security layer for 2 days before Hao arrived, which meant she had done most of the difficult work, and what remained was mostly resolution. They resolved it. Aaron's operation gave them the mountain path, a section of the regional topography that appeared on old military surveys and had been quietly removed from current ones. A narrow route running northeast toward an abandoned research facility that predated Greenvine's current program by 15 years. The facility appeared in Zhu's transfer documentation under the destination code Ashuo had memorized. Tangi was in San. He had been assigned to the district 3 weeks earlier. A garrison captain position, legitimate on paper, introduced to the team by Song Liang's office as additional support for the Zhao search. He was useful immediately: local contacts, facility knowledge, the kind of operational ease in unfamiliar territory that came from either extensive experience or prior preparation. Hao noticed the ease and filed it the same way he had filed Tangi's gracious concession, not as a conclusion, just as a weight on a scale he was still building. The mountain path took 2 days. Greenvine had stationed Overlord-level guardians at the critical choke points, not a subtle defense, but an effective one, in terrain where flanking was limited. Song Rui coordinated the engagements from the high ground, Jin Ying's wind ability clearing passage around 3 of the 4 obstacles, Tangi handling the 4th with a competence that read as practiced familiarity with the site's layout. That was when the weight on the scale resolved. Tangi had been through this path before. Not in preparation for the current mission, in preparation for its outcome. The abandoned facility was at the path's end, and in the facility's central records, Hao found Zhu's full designation file, not the redacted version that had been the ceiling of Song Rui's clearance, but the complete one. Alpha subject. Dragon-type affinity confirmed. Abnormal compatibility reading, off the theoretical scale, the same language Hao's own file used. A research note from Hong Zenon, dated 4 months after intake. Subject has developed capacity to interface directly with Dragon-type monster cores and direct their behavior. Reclassified from research asset to operational asset. His sister could command monsters. The sky had been doing something through the facility's skylights for 10 minutes by the time he finished reading, a building atmospheric pressure that he recognized, retroactively, as the approach of something large. Tangi's hand came through his shoulder from behind, the ice spike entering at the joint and pinning him to the wall. And Tangi said he was sorry it had come to this, but that Hao had served his purpose in locating the site, and what happened next was above his authority to prevent. He said Greenvine had been patient. Hao pulled forward off the spike, which was the kind of decision that required a moment of deliberate overriding of the body's natural recommendations, and turned. Tangji was already through the window, dropping to the mountain slope. Hao went after him, because the alternative was letting Tangji reach Greenvine's extraction team with confirmation of Zhu's location, and that was not acceptable. They went off the cliff edge together. Hao found the slope, kept his feet, and followed Tangji through the lower terrain, while the spike wound in his shoulder did its accounting. Tangji was good. In a fight of equivalent physical condition and matched ability types, the outcome would have been uncertain. What Hao had, besides the poison and the stored crystal energy, and 4 months of fighting things that were trying to actively mutate him, was a reason the outcome was not acceptable to lose. He cornered Tangji at the slope's base, where the terrain ran out against a rock face. He hit him with the contact compound, not to sedate, but to give Tangji a specific choice: stay conscious and answer questions, or not. Tangji looked at the rock face, and at Hao, and at the shoulder wound that was not, apparently, stopping Hao from standing there. He chose a third option. He activated his own ice ability inward, and the cold reached his organs before Hao could close the distance, and Tangji's secrets went with him. Hao stood over the body for a moment. He thought about what Tangji hadn't said, and what that meant for what Greenvine knew, and what Greenvine would do with it. Song Zhao found him there. He arrived from the upper slope, walking, not running, in the unhurried way of something that had not needed to run in a long time. Song Rui was somewhere in the facility behind Hao, and Hao's shoulder was operating at partial capacity, and Song Xiao looked at him with the evaluating calm of someone who had already decided how this encounter would go, and was now simply watching it confirm itself. He told Hao his absorption ability was genuine. He said he had confirmed it by watching the last 20 minutes. He said the level Hao was currently operating at was notable. For a human, exceptional. He paused on that last word in a way that made the classification feel provisional. He said there was a category beyond human, and that Hao was positioned closer to its threshold than any other person Song Xiao had encountered since his own transformation. He said this the way someone says a thing that is simply accurate and has no interest in whether it is welcomed. Song Rui came down the slope. She called her uncle's name. She said everything she had been carrying toward this conversation for months. The months of searching, the belief that he was still reachable, the reason she had left headquarters without authorization and traveled to San without filing proper movement orders, and stood now at a mountain base, looking at what remained of someone she had grown up looking up to. He listened. He waited until she was finished. He looked at her with something that might have been recognition and might have been the memory of recognition, which were not the same thing. Then he made a choice that did not require her to agree with it. Song Rui hit the ground. Her vital signs, according to Jin Ying's scanner when she reached the slope 30 seconds later, were absent. Hao moved before Jin Ying finished reading the number. Song Xiao held him, assessed him, and departed. Not from anything Hao had done, but because the battle had already produced what Song Xiao had come to confirm, and staying longer served no particular purpose. Kang Jin appeared from behind the facility's lower wall, where he had been observing. He moved toward the dying giant monster that Song Xiao had passed on his way down the slope. The same giant Hao's team had fought through the facility's perimeter, and crouched beside it, with the expression of a man doing quick arithmetic about opportunity. He reached for the core. Zhu descended between him and the monster. She arrived on the dragon's back, the same blue-white scaled creature from the cave opening, fully manifest in the afternoon light on the mountain slope. She looked at Changjin. She did not say anything. The dragon took a single step in his direction, and Changjin abandoned the arithmetic and left. Zhu came down from the dragon's back and crouched beside the giant's core and extracted it cleanly. She crossed the slope to where Hao was and placed the core in his hands. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you have been carrying the image of their face for months and the real version keeps not being what the image prepared you for. She said she had to go. He said she didn't. She said the people she was with had resources that were protecting her, and that walking away from that protection wasn't something she could do right now, and she said it in the voice of someone who has decided something and knows the person they're telling is going to disagree and has decided to say it anyway. She left on the dragon. He stood on the slope holding the giant's core and watching the direction she had gone until there was nothing to watch anymore. Song Liang authorized the experimental procedure within an hour of arriving at the mountain facility. Song Rui had no viable vital signs and no time for the standard medical escalation process. What was available was a regenerative worm dragon core from the facility's research stores. A specimen Green Vine had been developing for its capacity to replace damaged organic tissue in compatible subjects. The procedure involved transplanting the core's regenerative function directly into the site of Song Rui's cardiac damage. The risk, the worm dragon's core, had a probability of full integration that Jin Anshin, who ran the numbers twice, put at 63%. The remaining probability produced a subject who was no longer fully the person who went under. Song Lung authorized it. Song Rui was his daughter. The math was irrelevant. The core integrated at 41%. Song Rui woke up wrong. Her eyes wrong. Her posture wrong. The electromagnetic ability running at outputs that exceeded the bracelet's capacity and had moved into her own tissue. She came up from the table and the first thing she did was attack, because the thing that woke inside the regenerated body had not finished resolving the question of which memories were hers. Song Liang was the one who stayed in the room. He talked to her. Not explanations, not instructions. He talked to her the way he had talked to her when she was young and frightened of things that had specific names, things he could make smaller by naming them carefully. She hit him. He kept talking. She hit him again, with the electromagnetic output running through her arms, which hurt him and would have hurt anyone else significantly more. He kept talking. The thing running her body found the memory of his voice and couldn't resolve it as a threat. The thing that was Song Rui found the same voice and found it as a tether, and pulled herself along it back to the surface. She sat on the floor. She looked at her hands for a long time. She said she was very cold. He sat down beside her and said that was normal and that it would pass and that she was going to be fine. He said the last part with the same certainty he had used when she was 8 years old, and it had been equally uncertain and equally necessary. It mirrored, almost exactly, what Zhu's voice had done for Hao on a fog-flooded street years before. The structure was the same. A person at the edge of something irreversible, pulled back by a specific voice that represented a specific reason to stay on the right side of the line. Song Rui and Hao never discussed this parallel directly. But they both knew it was there. The Titan insect king's nest was found building in the residential district's outer ring, an overlord-level organism 3 times the standard classification, its swarm-laying capacity enough to collapse the local civilian perimeter without reinforcement. The main military force was committed elsewhere, and the window before the nest reached critical mass was measured in days. Song Liang gave Hao command of the holding squad. Song Ru, Jin Ying, Yongji, the patrolman. 5 people to hold a position against a threat that standard doctrine required a battalion for, until reinforcements could be redirected. They moved out. The journey to the nest's perimeter encountered a subordinate of Song Xiao's, a fully evolved humanoid monster that had retained enough cognition to operate independently, following Song Xiao's apparent policy of testing Hao's capability in graduated encounters. The fight was difficult and decisive and produced a new absorbed ability Hao had no immediate name for, which Jinying said she would classify later. Before the Titan, they encountered a secondary guardian, a silkworm-type creature whose defensive mechanism was psychological rather than physical, a fog-based illusion that reached into the target's perceptual system and constructed scenarios from their genuine fears. Song Rui went in fighting an uncle who was already gone. Hao went in fighting a cave and a helicopter window and the specific texture of absence that had defined 6 months of searching. Jin Ying was not susceptible. Her ability type ran at a frequency that the silkworm's mechanism was not calibrated for, and she pulled them out. She did it methodically, talking to each of them in the voice of a researcher narrating a process, which was not romantic but was present and real, and cut through the illusion the same way real voices always cut through constructed ones. The Titan's crater was vast. The swarm was beyond count. They held the perimeter for 4 hours, Hao coordinating from the center, Yongji taking positions that generated injury at a rate his body processed just barely faster than it accrued. the patrolman running communication between the squad's flanks with a calm professionalism that bore no resemblance to the chronically late border recruit who had been giving Hao cover stories at Kishi a year ago. Yang Xing arrived with Song Liang. Song Liang used a spatial containment ability, an S-rank technique that bent the geometry of the crater's space inward, compressing the Titan's freedom of movement, and buying the kind of time that the squad had been buying expensively all afternoon. The barrier held. Hong Zenon arrived 20 minutes after the barrier went up. He was a small, composed man, with the bearing of someone who had spent years operating at a level of institutional confidence that made physical confrontation seem remote. He stood at the crater's edge and explained, in the tone of someone correcting a misunderstanding, that the crisis had been engineered by Greenvine's research division to harvest Titan-class biological material, and that the military's containment efforts had been a useful accelerant to the harvest timeline, and that they were welcome to stand down. He looked at the crater. He said that Zhu had agreed to assist. What Hong Zhanan had told Zhu, the specific lie that had motivated her cooperation, was that the military's leadership had reviewed the operational cost of Hao's absorption ability and had concluded that the risk of eventual loss of control outweighed the strategic benefit, and that the formal recommendation had been to allow Hao to be killed in a high-risk engagement rather than expend resources protecting him. He had shown her documentation. The documentation had been produced by Greenvine's administrative team and was indistinguishable from the real thing to someone who had spent the preceding months inside Greenvine's own institutional structure. She merged her consciousness with the Titan. The barrier holding the swarm cracked from the inside. Song Liang's spatial technique required continuous output against a stable target, a target being actively directed by a human consciousness operating at dragon-type compatibility was not stable. The barrier collapsed. The swarm moved. Hao went directly into the crater. Not through the swarm, which was the difference between a plan and the absence of one. He moved at the speed his crystal could push him, absorbing the damage the swarm inflicted en route as fuel rather than injury. A conversion efficiency that he had been building toward for months, and that now ran faster than the swarm could maintain its output. He reached the Titan's core housing, a structure at the organism's center where the Queen Intelligence interfaced with Zhu's merged consciousness, and he drove his hand into it. The energy release was the worst thing he had experienced since the Queen Overlord in the beehive nest, which had nearly killed him in a different way. He held on. He pulled. The core's housing gave, the connection severed, the backlash traveled up his arm and across his chest, and hit the crystal at a density that set his entire body temperature rising, and kept rising. He fell beside Zhu and held her face with a hand that was too hot, and said her name, and said it again, and then said the things you say to someone when you are not sure they can hear you, but the alternative to saying them is silence. Her eyes opened. She looked at him with the expression of someone coming back from somewhere very far, finding the way by a sound. She said his name. He said he had been looking for a while. She started to cry, and he held on to her, and the temperature of his hand was still wrong, and the crystal was cracking in a new way. But none of that was the most important thing happening at the moment. She turned on Hong Zenon's forces 40 seconds later, with a precision and ferocity that efficiently communicated the nature of her recalibrated position. The dragon answered her, and Hong Zenon's perimeter team answered only to people who were paying them, and Zhu had demonstrated that the cost of opposition was not in their employment agreement. Song Xiao arrived into the aftermath. He killed 7 of Greenvine's fighters in the course of crossing the crater, not from particular necessity, but from the evaluative way he moved through spaces, clearing what was in the way. He reached his brother Song Lang and stopped, and looked at him across the distance of everything that had happened since the incident that had changed Song Xiao, and he said that Lang had known, at the time, what the outcome of that incident would be, and had authorized it anyway. Song Liang did not deny it. Song Xiao said he had thought for a long time about what to do with that knowledge, and that the answer he had arrived at was not forgiveness. He said he was also not finished deciding what came after that. He offered Zhu the same evolution he had offered Hao in the mountain facility, the threshold beyond ordinary humanity, the transformation that had taken him, and that he was no longer certain was the catastrophe everyone categorized it as. Song Liang and Zhu attacked him simultaneously, because simultaneous was the correct approach to someone at Song Xiao's level, and they had both, independently, arrived at that conclusion in the same moment. The combined attack landed. The smoke from the energy exchange cleared in stages, and Song Zhao stood in the dissipating cloud and said, in the voice that had been his, and would always be his regardless of what his body had become, that the contest was over. He looked at the unconscious form of Yan Hao, carried to the crater's edge by Song Rui and Jin Ying, and the patrolman in the minutes since the Titan's connection was severed. He said Hao would be more interesting when he was finished becoming what he was becoming. Then the red fog around Hao's unconscious body shifted. Not drifted, shifted. The way weather shifts when a pressure system changes. It pulled inward, concentrating toward him, drawn by something in the crystal, or in the biology that the crystal was built from. Hao's body heat, which had been rising since the core housing destruction, passed the threshold that normally indicated loss of control. And then his body ignited, not metaphorically. A column of red-edged fire rose from his prone form into the night sky, visible from the nearest inhabited district, reading on every monitoring instrument in the military's perimeter network as an energy signature, with no existing classification. Song Rui, who had spent her own recent experience on the wrong side of a transformation and knew what that edge felt like, drove her electromagnetic ability into him and called his name, and drove more power in and called it again. Jin Ying put her hand on Song Rui's arm and said, quietly, that if she pushed any more, the interaction between Song Rui's half-integrated core and Hao's current state would produce an outcome neither of them would survive. Song Rui looked at the column of fire rising from the person who had spent weeks sitting with her on a hospital roof while she found her way back to herself, and she made herself hold still, and she said his name anyway. The fire kept burning, the night kept waiting, and whatever Yan Hao was in the process of becoming, it had not finished becoming it yet.